Good afternoon, and welcome to this latest web seminar by Bitgartner. My name is John Kowalski. I'm part of the marketing team here. And today we have a special presentation. Sean Devanch, Senior Applications Engineer for Global Paint Vehicle Operations at Ford Motor Company, will be presenting along with our Business Line Manager for Automotive, Ray Roby. They got a great presentation planned for you. We are recording this, and following the presentation, and probably in the morning, you'll receive an email with the recording along with the presentation materials for you to review. Also, time permitting, we'll answer any questions we can. If not, we'll do the follow-ups and get answers to those questions. But please, log any questions you may have in the Q&A box located in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and we'll get to them time permitting. So with that, let me introduce Sean Devanch for you. He's going to kick it off. Welcome, Sean.
Well, thank you for having me. I'd like to discuss with you guys the optimization of color harmony through DataShare. This is a project that Ray Roby and myself, or I should say Ford Motor Company and BICMAC, have worked on very hard through the last two years, I'd say, Ray. And what we have done some presentations in the past at CERCAR and Automotive Circle. And then also we did some presentations of this material for BICMAC in Mexico. And what we're doing is continuing on with some of the core theories of the DataShare concept. And I'm going to actually be able to share some some nice achievements that we've done at Ford Motor Company through some of our recent launches. To start, here is our title page. We're just going to move right into some of the data here. Just make sure I got my computer, no technical stuff here. Okay. So the benefits of DataShare. What it does is it's going to provide the ability for the OEM and a hang-on part supplier, a tier 1, tier 2 supplier to share digital color data through color concept into the manufacturing phase. As well, it allows the data to become a reinforcement tool to visual acceptance. In this digital world, or this world that we're pushing consistently to move to technology, it seems like the paint world still has the visual acceptance as our number one kind of mainstay. And what we're looking at is not to necessarily overturn visual acceptance, but to reinforce it and to help align data with visual. As well as digital data can be stored in a file share system to provide open source transparency for vested suppliers and provide both historical and real-time data. And what I mean by that is that a supplier could actually be able to pull data from an OEM or a body unit that was measured in a plant, or vice versa, that the plant, our plant manufacturing center or our paint OEM supplier could actually pull real-time data as it's measured from a part supplier as well. And then digital color data can be stored for the life of a program, can be utilized for future application processes, optimization, quality, and most important, robust color harmony. And when I mean future application is, say we have a high flake color or a color that we realize does not work very well in a 3-wet process. We would be able to use that historical data to look at maybe the application equipment we use in a certain manufacturing facility and look at the color palette that might be advantageous to that particular manufacturing facility or that particular color line. So if we have failures in the past or great successes, we can use that data to move forward. I'm going to let Ray take over for a minute. I just had the intro there. She's going to take us through kind of digital color acceptance and the visual acceptance part of this presentation, and then I'll be back on to talk about data and moving forward. Ray?
In this slide, you can see on the left side, there's a lot of variation between the suppliers and the plants. And what happens here is nobody's really going to the same place. They're all trying to satisfy maybe multiple plants, or different suppliers are sending different things in, and OEMs are telling them different ways to move. So what's really important is to do a digital standard. And for a digital standard, everybody's going to the same center point. So there's no longer, like people would say, chasing the body or something like that. Everyone's going to the same place. So for the BICMAC instrument, it has multi-angle color measurement. The illumination is at 45 degrees. The detection is at 6 angles, the -15, the 15, the 25, the 45, the 75, and the 110. And what we found is that the -15 is usually only used if you have like a color shifting pigment. So if it goes from like red to green or blue to yellow or something like that. But for all the other colors, we're using the 15 through the 110, except for solids that only use the 45. The instrument also can characterize your sparkle, so your actual flake, and it has direct illumination, 15, 45, and 75, and there's a camera detection at 0 that takes a picture, and that can be used to establish if you have either the right flake or if you have the right process condition. And then graininess is diffuse illumination, and that, if you look, there's like a half yellow circle, and that's where the diffuse illumination is. There's like a white hemisphere in the instrument itself, and that gives you the diffuse illumination. So that would be like under a cloudy sky. So what's important is when we look at vehicles, we know that all these different parts that actually match up to each other could have different paints, they could have different paint suppliers, they could have different applications, they could have different substrates, and all this stuff has to, in the end, look very harmonious to the other parts, because when customers look at these vehicles, when they see color variation from part to part, they don't always know what they see, but what they do know is that the car doesn't look as luxurious as they want, or maybe has a cheaper feel. So when Sean shows you all the data that he's going to show you, what we found is really important is that people need to look at the actual, or understand the actual angle they're looking at. So in this case, when we're looking at this fascia, we're looking at the 25 or the 45 angle. And another thing that can happen is that if there's two people standing and looking at a vehicle and the sun's right in the center, I could think it's a perfect match if I'm on the right side, and if I'm on the left side, I could think it's a very bad match. And the reason is that I'm looking at the 15 angle, and they're looking at the 110 angle. So if I look at the data, you can see that my angle would be the 15 angle, where my data looks really good at 0.66 for delta E combo, and the 110 angle is actually out of spec at 2.43 or 2.40. So it's important you know what angle you're looking at, or even if you try to look at the same angle as someone else, if they're not agreeing with what you see, and maybe it's just because of the angle that they're looking at. So another thing that's important is we always talk about this 10 and 2 time is the ideal time to perform the color harmony reviews. And also, depending on where you are in the world, what you see can change. And depending on if it's summer or winter. So if I'm in Munich, I have an angle of incidence of 61. If I'm in Detroit on the same day at the same time, I have an angle of incidence of 70, and if I'm in Shanghai on the same date and same time, I have an angle of incidence of 82. And if I'm in Cape Town, I have an angle of incidence of 32. So what does this mean? If I'm in Munich, I'm looking at the 75-degree angle. If I'm in Shanghai, I'm looking at the 110 angle, and if I'm in Cape Town, I'm looking at the 45 angle. So if I had the same vehicle in all these 3 locations, the same day, same time, everything would be the same. If I'm in Cape Town, I think the car is good. If I'm in Munich, I think it's okay, but needs improvement. And if I'm in Shanghai, I'm like, I don't like this car. I don't want to ship it. So this is also something that's important where you are in the world.
And one thing to add, Ray, is when we're looking at all 5 angles, the key here is that, we're no longer just shipping to our own country, where we have this same angle of incidence. These cars are, whether they're painted in, wherever they're painted in the world, these are shipped across the world. So we have to make sure that we're not just looking at one viewing angle. And that's where digital data comes in to allow us to look at all 5 angles. Sorry about that.
The other thing that's important is the time of year. So when I'm in June 21st, I'm looking at the 75 or the 110, and when I get into September or March, I'm looking at the 45. And December, I'm looking at the 45 or the 75. So a lot of the initial color harmonies happen in June, and then maybe your first build isn't until September. So in June, you were looking at the 75 or the 110, and then in September, you're looking at the 45. Maybe your color position has not changed at all, but your viewing angle has changed, so you may not like the car in September that you approved in June. So it's really important to look at all the angles, even though you're only technically viewing the 75 or the 110 at the initial build stage. The other thing that's important is the height of the observer. So I know, like, if I'm standing next to Sean, he's very tall. If he has a different opinion of the vehicle than I do, I either stand on my tiptoes, or he has to bend down to my level to look at the same angle. Or you can, if you're shorter, you can move closer, and the taller person can move farther away. Vertical panels are very important because this is where the harmony is. So on a flat panel, we're looking at approximately the 75-degree angle. But if we look at the curved surface, we're actually looking at even the 25-degree angle. So a lot of times what we hear is that when the two, the fascia and the body match up to each other, they don't look the same, even though the numbers are passing. And this is something that you have to make sure you're aware of, that you might be looking at 2 different angles. On horizontal surfaces, it's important to realize where the sun is. If the sun's behind you, you're looking at the 75 or the 110. If the sun's in front of you, you're looking at the 15 or even the minus 15. So for horizontal panels, what's important is the location of the sun relative to where you're looking.
Another key thing there is that if you do have a fascia match, and that is going to a vertical surface or as a flat surface, as Ray described before, you are looking at a 15-degree angle from the hood possibly against a 45 to 75 degree possibility for that horizontal or that hang-on part. So there's another instance where the orientation of a part to the body can influence the observer.
So just in summary, there's many things you have to remember. The influence of the sun position, whether it's the time of day, the location in the world, the season, the influence of the observer, how tall they are, the distance to the vehicle. And then when you look at the evaluation of different panels themselves, the vertical panels could be 45, 75, 110. Horizontal panels could be 15, minus 15, and 110. And then, like we've been talking about kind of the whole time, this mounting orientation of the add-on parts.
Yeah, and we had an incident with the initial picture that was on our slide here was with the Lincoln Navigator. And actually, we ran into, at Ford Motor Company, we ran into an issue with the mounting orientation of add-on parts. We actually had enough of a difference between our fender viewing angle and our fascia viewing angle that both parts were okay to standard and to digital standard, but because of the travel, you would see a more of a flash or a 25-degree angle, the lighter part of the viewing angle on the fender, and you were seeing a very, like the 75 or almost the flop on the fascia. So even though both would pass to master, it still did not look very good visually. So we have actually incorporated standards into our product development or our pre-build design specs that limit the percent the percent orientation between a fender and a fascia to try to keep them on the same viewing angle, so we have a better chance for harmony and we can be more robust with that process. So that's just some of the things we're doing at Ford, utilizing this type of visual evaluation stuff that Ray just discussed.
And the other thing that's really important is when you measure the orientation of the instrument. So the instrument, the light source is coming from, we say, the top of the instrument, but where those two LEDs are, also if you take the bottom cover off, there's an arrow that shows you where the light source is coming from. And you want to make sure this mimics the sun as close as possible, because that's where you're evaluating. Normally is outdoors. One thing, the horizontal surfaces, there's two different methods they do. One is where they have the LEDs facing towards the glass. So if I'm measuring the hood or the trunk, I'm always facing towards the glass, or they do it with the line flow of their process. So they would measure always in the same direction with the LEDs facing the same direction. But this is kind of a personal preference because, again, like I showed you, depending on where the light is or the sun is, you're going to get two different answers. So it just depends on personal preference for that, for horizontal surfaces.
Okay, and so now we want to talk a little bit about data share. And what can we do with data share? And what I'm speaking about here is when we measure with that instrument, where does that data go and how can we utilize that to make our process for color harmony better? So, when we discussed with our hang-on part suppliers, when we have discussions with our OEM paint suppliers, is, some of the common things that come up consistently are, boy, it would be great to know what the color of the fascia is prior to one of our pre-builds. And when I talk about pilot builds, when we're launching a new product, the only product that we have available in the paint shop for Ford and our OEM supplier is the body. Once it leaves the paint shop, that is where it goes and gets its hang-on parts. So we don't see that in the paint shop, but yet we have to go to a standard. Same thing with a fascia supplier. They're working with equipment, but they're also both getting visual assessments. So it is slightly, like I like to say with visual, it's interpretation of the observer of what they like and what they feel looks good to the master. So if we're both working with individual sets of eyes, we might get visual feedback from two different people that might have similar likes or similar dislikes, and we could be slightly skewed because of that. So what we want to do is have a way that all the stuff that we measure can be put into what we can call a data share file or a data share center. And this is where it can be a free form, a pick and play. A supplier could come in and grab data. An OEM can come in and grab data. We have data that can look at long-term, short-term, whatever we need. And kind of here, I just have a directional process flow. What we have is if we're at the OEM paint shop, which would be where I am right today, is Michigan Assembly Plant for Ford Motor Company. We would go ahead and collect data from our pilot builds or our normal production builds, and then we could do a data dump into our OEM color directory. At the same time, tier 2 or tier 1 part suppliers, manufacturers of fascias, mirror housings, bumpers, liftgate handles, so be it, they are also underneath the same control plans to collect data. That data could also be dumped into the same shared access. At this point now, we have the ability for both the OEM and the part 2 tier 2 part supplier to have access to this data. We also have the ability, if we wanted to control it from ourselves, that we could issue a harmony report based on combining databases. in the BICMAX software that we all utilize with our equipment, our field instruments. We have the ability to select multiple databases and be able to bring those in and generate color reports, which we'll see later. This could be sent back out to the OEMs to see where the body position is, or they could create this themselves. That's an open-ended item here at Ford. We're looking into working with our subsidiaries in India, where we do a lot of our controls to kind of come up with the best ways to generate reports. We're doing that somewhat with BIC as we move forward to look at the best ways. And then we also have something where we could put it out to our color launch teams in the field, and they could do that. So what I have there is whether we're doing this in-house or if we're producing field reports. So, but this is just a standard data flow, very simple access. It'll be in more detail as, you know, we kind of work with Ford IT and some of the things there to move forward. But we have been green lit, I guess you could say, from senior management based on some of the results that we've done with myself and Ray working on some beta type projects, that this is something that we're definitely going to push forward, and we're getting more support to get IT support and to have a full working data share folders. Okay, and then Ray and I kind of worked together and we kind of figured out our milestones for what we want to call like engineering concept and development of color through its phase or its kind of its workability life. So we have feasibility and workability. That's kind of the concept of color where somebody says, I don't know if we have some people in the audience that are in that field, but, you know, in the color creation world, maybe somebody brings in a swatch of material and they say, I love this color, it should be put on a car. And then we go and tell our paint suppliers, go figure out how to do this. And then they do a feasibility and workability study, and we decide if we can make that can of paint or not make that can of paint. What Ray and I suggest is that every time we do one of those measurements, we're taking a look at that digital data with visual reviews, and we are getting our data structure to support the visual, what we see, so we can move forward into the next phase, which would be correlation. What we look at correlation is, can we do the same thing that in the lab that we do in our plants, or vice versa, lab to lab, from, I'll call it a supplier. If I'm working now with BSF here at Michigan Assembly Plant, BSF has a satellite facility. They need to produce batch panels for the paint that they're going to ship into the facility. We want to make sure that the correlation of how they spray out that tote is the same way that it correlates to what we do in the line, or if we're doing lab trials where we're going to do new applicators or new processes, we can create some of this stuff in a lab and move it over to a plant line. Same thing here. When we take that and we do all our correlation work, then we have to take all that information and drop it into our trials and launch. This is where we're doing, to use Ford acronyms, our TT builds, our PP builds, our mass production 1 build, our mass production 2 build, up to job 1. We want to be able to have a tracking record of all the data to show whether it's improved, whether we've had troubles throughout the launch, and then we can go back and analyze and look at how we can get better. But unless we have a digital trail, it's very hard to go back and just go from visual concepts or visual assessments. We'll have hard, raw data to be able to look at. And then finally, we can get into what we call like the maintenance and production. After we've done all our work and we've gotten a color and we brought it to launch, we went ahead and launched that vehicle. How do we maintain color, and how do we look for how we can continuously still improve? So what I want to look at in paint workability, this is where the DOEs and that type of thing come in. And I just put a quick DOE up here that maybe is looking at a standard blue color. That's a swatch that we may have hit. And then we want to look at what happens when we move the process parameters. For people familiar with painting, if we're looking at, a 2-pass or a metallic, maybe what happens when we increase the fluids, but, how we atomize the paint, we reduce how we atomize. So maybe we're looking at high fluids, low atomization. How does the color shift? We'll have that data, and what we can start to do is build a workability map of our data based around maybe these 5 shades. So if you look at this, these 5 panels I have here, it's actually one single can of paint, but how much the color can shift based on your application technique. So what this helps us is right in the workability phases of coming up with a color design, we can very early understand the data and the visual correlation of what happens when we start to move application parameters in one direction, or when paint is applied in a certain way. And this also helps us build up our digital tolerances, as Ray discussed with the digital standard. As we start to see this workability, we know how much paint can shift, and it helps us tolerance of what we can say is a pass or fail digitally. And just to expound on that a little bit, there is, this kind of gives us an example when I talk about what that DOE or that workability is. So you can see on the scale there, I go from wet to dry, and that would be a wet film application. So if we're talking about like a Bell or a Bell paint applicator, maybe a dry application would be at a very high RPM. So we're a very intense explosion or a very intense atomization of the paint, versus the wet would be a very slow or a very slow bell speed or a very slow atomization. We're basically a larger droplet size. And then basically we're looking at the film deposits as applied from thin to thick. So we could look at a very thin film build with a very high atomization, from a very thick or a very high film build to a very low atomization. So we can look at what happens with this paint as we move forward. And once again, I don't have some data from here because we haven't utilized this too much in the workability phase. But what we're able to do is establish, and I like to think about it as we're establishing our workability. So if you look at this graph, we can start to build data around this center standard control panel to kind of help tolerance ourselves and to understand what might be visually an unacceptable call with the data that's been applied. So if somebody looked at the high atomization versus low paint film in the upper left corner of this slide and says, visually, this will never sell, this looks horrible compared to the standard that we liked, we'll have the data from that. And as our data starts to climb in that direction because of either pigment adjustments, atomization, we can kind of halt that and say, we know this is a direction that we don't want to go. So this is where this really helps us understand that and helps us control things in the workability phase. Now I want to look into the second phase we talked about. Go ahead.
Can I make one comment? So back to the last slide.
Yes.
This is also one that can help with the sparkle and graininess numbers, because you can figure out if you're actually changing the orientation of the flake with the Bic Mac. So Sean's starting to use those numbers now, hopefully. So
Yeah, actually we are, Ray. I did a topic for another day, but there was some field studies conducted over the summer with kind of benchmark appearance and looking at sparkle and graininess. So that is something else that we're incorporating in the Ford motor. Okay, just taking a look here and into our next phase that we talked about. This is the paint color correlation phase. And some of the benefits that using digital data to help reinforce the visual, improved lab correlation can be developed with both visual and digital color data. What this does is it allows for improved batch-to-batch color correlation. So for our paint suppliers, that helps improve scrap or rejects of totes. Improve reliability of lab development for color. What I like to say is that a lab should be a lab and a paint line should be for production. So as we establish good lab correlation in our lab facilities, when we do have color issues or application issues in the plant, we can actually use our labs to solve those issues as opposed to running multiple trials in a plant. And as we know that anybody works in manufacturing, every time a trial goes down a paint line, that is one unit that we did not produce, and that is money lost. And then it also allows our paint manufacturers to understand individual processes at both the OEM and the supplier level. Okay, so when I talk about that is how does our paint perform in multiple areas? So if we do have, I think Ray showed that very first slide where it said plant 1, plant 2, supplier 1, supplier 2, where we have maybe a batch of silver paint that is manufactured, but it's maybe sent to 3 different manufacturing facilities. what is going on at those different facilities with their application processes. So that gives us a little bit more understanding of what happens from plant to plant as well. And then basically, just at the end of that, obviously we can improve our correlation, we can utilize data share for visual acceptance of colors. And I think the most important thing is it opens up communication channels, and color is not proprietary. It opens up the transparency of color data for the supply base and the OEM and us as the manufacturing facility as well. So it's a really, I think about correlation. It could be correlation / communication. That is the most important part at this stage. Now here is an example. I said I wanted to use some real live correlation. This was a project that we just completed with Ford. This is for something that we're doing down in Hermosillo in one of our Mexico manufacturing facilities. What we did was took the plant trials that we did here, these lab trials, we developed to a color standard for a certain color that we got visual acceptance that was okay. I still didn't necessarily 100% disagree with the 15-degree angle, but the call was basically the visual call was slight light. So I assume that they're looking at maybe the 25 or the 45 or the 75, somewhere along those lines visually. And they were thinking that we're on the light side. So what we're able to do is analyze that data, kind of look at the reference points or the visual angles that they were reviewing. And you can see once we got to the plant trials, we made our correction and application and also with the paint supplier. And we were able to move that slightly darker. And our visual call at the plant with one trial, this is the first body that we painted, and we were able to bring this body out into the yard and have our design team take a look at it and visually assess, and we deemed it saleable and we moved on. So this is an excellent example of eliminating at least 3 to 4 line trials to get to a color in a saleable position. And very strong correlation. So if we did have to do some work back at the lab, I'd feel very comfortable with what they do and what they would drive forward.
And just to Sean's point, I think that's like the hugest thing where you can, the first time you run a body, you're on color. That's like a huge savings to the OEM that
Yes.
They're actually matching what they see in the lab.
And we have been deemed, and I'm sure if there's other OEMs on here, I'm not sure who's listening, but we've been deemed, it seems, in build phase versus build phases in our launch schedule, that we have to be on color earlier and earlier and earlier in our launch phases. It seems like the vehicles are into a saleable position sooner and sooner. So this is one of the concepts that working with Ray that we said, how can we help improve in our correlation process, and how can we improve for what we're going to step in here with trials and launch, is utilizing this data with visual impact. Because it's key is if I have a design quality or if I have somebody that's responsible for doing the visual assessment, if I am engaging with that person at the lab correlation phase and actually using them with visual and then looking at my data, I can help project or I can predict where I think I'm going to be at the plant. And this is something that we spoke about at CERCAR last year, that yes, I think we can predict where we are going to be in color space. And this slide proved it when we did that for real in the field. This was something that we moved right into a greenfield project. We had to be saleable because cars were going to go to the dealership right away. I said we could do it, and here's where we ended up, and it was a success story all the way around. So as we move into our next phase, what we call our trials and launch for Color Harmony, what I just explained, and I think one of the biggest key things here are cost savings, bodies, everything like that. We have to, as an application team, request X amount of sheet metal in order to continuously improve or work on our color in the plant. We can reduce the amount of plant line trials to establish color for both the OEM. And I think in the future, our hang-on part suppliers could also produce less scrap as they do their development of color and they start to work on these concepts. Reduce trial batches for a paint supplier as their correlation is improved. One of the key things here is to establish robust color harmony for the entire vehicle earlier in launch milestones. We also have the ability to monitor color harmony digitally throughout the entire launch phase to reinforce the visual acceptance, as well as we utilize the ability to share data with all interested parties for quick response and actions during launch phase. So this is open source data, and we share the data. We use this in our application, VRT meetings, anything that we can do to help improve. We have that data readily and available to us. And then once I said again, this is about communication between cross-functional teams, paint and part suppliers. Anybody that has a vested interest in color on this can have the ability to communicate with this data and help us improve. Okay, here is an example of no communication between suppliers prior to a pilot build. So my assumption here is that the data shows good color harmony for the 25-degree angle. So, not having the past history on this is just data that I had to share. I would assume that those body and that fascia positions were probably visually assessed at that 25-degree angle. But as you can see, it doesn't really matter which ones I call which. If blue is the body and yellow is the fascia, and showing what Ray showed you before with the ability to see up to four different viewing angles around the world, or just across several months, we could see that it would fail at the 45, it would fail at the 75. The hood would look poor at either the 15 or the 110. But yet, if we look at the Delta L and everything there for the 25-degree angle, we're very happy with things. So if it would have been happily, if this visually would have been assessed on a day that we're actually looking at the 25, we may not have done any more work. But having the ability to assess all 5 angles digitally to a digital standard tells us we have a long way to go on this color. So whether we were visually accepted or not, us looking at this and doing a data share and looking at our parts versus body instantly tells us that we're not ready for color harmony, and that we need to go back to the drawing board and do what we need to do to help shift our color in the appropriate directions to standard, because that's where we should be always working to, is the center of that standard. Now here is an example of very good color harmony at the pilot level. This is our first build of a unit, and this goes to our Michigan assembly plant people. This is with BSF and some friends from Ventra that have worked with me consistently on these projects and have been very open to data share. So this is where we are actually, because I have some of the constraints with IT, I've been our intermediary going back and forth, but with BSF actually providing body data to our fascia supplier, and our fascia supplier providing their data back to our BSF supplier, working back and forth. And we came in here, and this is pretty much the first shots of fascias and the first shots of the body lined up. And you can see, if I go back to somewhere where we didn't like it, you can see the spread of that data of something that we would not consider good. And even though we have a little bit of work to do on a couple of things, this is, I feel, very good for color harmony moving into our very first shot where we're mating up a part to the body. Visually, this looked very strong, and our design quality people, the visual assessors, are very happy. Internally, analyzing this data even further, we know we have continuous improvement to get closer to the center of that standard. As you can see, there's a couple little outliers here and there, a couple of guys that are dark, but when you do look at the scale and that tolerancing, it's tight, and we were really pleased with our work there. This is an example here of a color data report as well. So this is just looking at, similar to what I just showed you here with the plant line trials. This was a real life example, as well as this is. And basically what we can do is, I wanted to show you a little bit of the output of some of the printable charts from utilizing Smart Chart, where before you saw a lot of just dots, and you might wonder what those are. This actually, I didn't include it because the slide was a little bit tough, but in a PDF format, this actually shows what each individual part would be based off of a legend. So, your green triangle might be the fender, and then hopefully right next to that would be that gold circle would be our fascia. It shows how we do throughout all 5 angles, and you can identify each part. So this would be an output of the color harmony report that I was showing you that you could share both with supplier and paint OEM, where we could review this data in a launch phase and what we might need to do to be better, what we might need to do, what we can do from any type of correlation, any type of application workability concepts. Okay, and then finally, I just want to get into color harmony maintenance. What we have here is typically what we do once we go into job one and the plant takes over and they have to kind of maintain that color. What we do is utilize the BIC instruments and use their panel match functions, where actually you're looking at both parts to a standard, but we also look at the relationship between those two parts digitally. And you can see here where we have the green and red arrows, green and red circles are color match points that we're able to measure. And then we can actually generate a report and look at these parts either for the day or for over time. So this is where we can start to look at, if we look at a period of 1 month, 2 month, 3 month, are we getting worse? Are we staying consistent? Are we getting better for color? Our color visual acceptance has already been established. Our tolerances are established. And so we have a robust digital system that we can maintain digital color harmony from that point forward. This would be a color harmony maintenance 5 angles over time. So you're looking at the delta L in the first column. Second column would be your delta A, and your delta B for the third column. This would be an example, once again, of maybe viewing the 25 delta L and looking for a lightness darkness on that particular angle. You can see that maybe somebody would say that this is okay between fender and fascia. But if you look at, when you look at the entirety of this graph, you can see that unless we're only viewing the 25 and the 110, I don't think we'd be very happy with this color, and we know we'd have work to do. So this is where we have the ability to look at color over time and see how we're performing, whether we're performing well, or we know that we should be continuously improving on something or having instantaneous action. And one of the keys there is large amounts of data can be mined from multiple databases of points in time. They can be viewed in color space and reference against visual comments and acceptance. So this can kind of reinforce maybe our weekly yard audits or bi-monthly, bi-weekly yard audits that we look at color outside, as well as taking data in our control plans. Here's an example of looking at 5 angles of travel data over time, particularly with a fender and a fascia. And so if these were by VIN numbers, me as a manufacturer, I might want to look at units 3 and 4 out in the yard to see if they're visually okay and they're acceptable to ship. Because if you look at the delta L, there's a big difference on that 25, and we have a bit of a color difference on our yellow blue going over there with these two colors. So was there an issue with a color change? Was there an application issue? Was there a line fault? Was an oven down? Did it stay in the oven? You would have all these questions to ask about these particular vehicles. And then you would probably want to go and do an audit out in the field and make sure that that car is okay before it goes to a dealer. So that's one of the benefits there, that we could actually look at this in real time and be able to be able to assess if we're at risk to ship or not. And then finally, this is this is one that I like. I'm a fan of box plots. And so what I can do is be able to take a look at fender and fascia over time. I can kind of look at my range of samples. I can look at, my stems. Am I, more susceptible for the fender to move light, or is it more susceptible to move dark in a particular angle? And I can and then what's kind of nice there is that we almost get these nice pink filters that say, obviously, if we look at this guy here, we see quite a bit of range of lightness and darkness on the 15, but then we get more consistent as we move from the 25, 45, 75 into the 110. So to me, this is a very acceptable color. We know that the 15-degree angle is probably our biggest variant. Can't speak for everyone, but I know that we work out hard on that. And then you can see on Delta A, we're very consistent as we travel, as well as there's a little bit of range there in the Delta B, but this color might be deemed acceptable, but we could see that maybe the fascia has a little bit of movement that it should be doing on the 15 and the 25 to move closer to standard. Well, these are just a couple of different ways that you can look at color in a maintenance function. To each person, maybe some people like travel graphs, maybe some people like scatter plots, or in my case, I'm a believer in the box plot. I like to look at those, and I know that some of my senior management does. And this is a color report that I'm actually looking at utilizing in the future. So that is kind of my take on digital color, and you can see how I took you through the 4 phases. And for that, I think I'm finished here, and I'd open it up for any questions.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Ray.
Sorry, one quick comment.
Oh, I think Ray's got a comment.
I got a comment. So all of the plots that he generated or that he talked about in here are all available in SmartChart, just an FYI.
Oh, I thought I did say that, Ray.
Oh, I don't know if you said that.
I will reiterate that we personally utilize SmartChart to generate our data structure for Ford, and we are in partnership with them with equipment and the software. And as we move forward, a lot of the input that we have as a company here, BIC does listen to our needs. I believe this is one of the needs that were generated out of their latest release of SmartChart, that the box plot function is available now, and I think we can utilize that for appearance as well if you have a wave scan. So this is some exciting stuff for us, and this is really fun for me as we move forward and we look more and more digitally how color is impacted. We have the tools to move forward. Now, once again, if there's questions, I'd be happy to try to answer.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, please log them in the Q&A box, and we have some time left, we can get to them. One question that I did get, Sean and Ray, has there been consideration for data share with internal parts, or I'm sorry, interior parts?
I'm not sure on that, but I couldn't see why it would not be used across the board. Anywhere that I think that you see visual and there's ability, or if we have the ability to measure that part with a digital reference, I think it should always be used as a reinforcement tool or a tool or a application tool to be better.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Excellent. And then you just alluded to, just a couple minutes ago that the data share can also be used for wave scan. That's correct?
I know that I use SmartChart for that, but definitely as we start to, as the customer becomes more frugal, and especially in the higher end, the higher end vehicles that we're starting to supply, the difference of feel or appearance from a fascia to a fender certainly can be part of this overall digital concept. So to be able to look at wave structure, the WD versus the WD of the fascia versus the WD of the part. If we just talk about short wave, long wave, something simple for everyone to a quick concept, are we very similar to our long wave as the part? Is the eye going to be happy with what they see between the two? So I don't think it would be any issue at all to move into more of a digital share for appearance as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Excellent. Other questions out there? Relatively quiet audience. That was a lot of good information. So you might be just digesting. As I mentioned, we are recording this, and we'll send out tomorrow follow-ups as well as presentation materials, including the recording. Sean and Ray, were there any specific challenges that kind of surprised you along the way, or some things that surprised you in a good way?
I think one of the few things that I did notice is that surprised a little bit on the impact of viewing angle. And I can't speak for Ray, but one of the examples here is reviewing panels or bodies in Michigan, and then going down into the Arizona or the Sonora Desert in Mexico, utilizing the same digital data, but yet looking at the vehicle again in, what I would determine different sunlight. and maybe what somebody visually sees there versus what's there, and then being able to have the data to back up that maybe that slight visual variance just because we're in two different locations, and sun angle and visual, the visual angle does provide some impact.
Okay. Wonderful. And it looks like, Ray, I'm trying to get you back on here. It looks like you dropped for some reason. Oh, you are.
Can you hear me?
Yes, there you are.
Okay. So I'm okay. I just, my computer decided to shut down and update, so.
Oh, good timing.
And Ray, they were just asking about, were there any surprises to us when we were working on this data and some things there? And what I had mentioned was that the visual calls in Michigan, and then the visual calls in the Sonora Desert down in Hermosillo were slightly different, but yet the data was very similar. So, that did surprise me a little bit with the impact of the sun. And, when you see that concept on a slide, it's one thing, but then when you live it, it's another.
Yeah.
And I think that the understanding and for other people that maybe don't understand what's happening visually, the ability to help educate, I think, leads to a lot better visual assessment. And that helps us with the interpretation of what they see to the data.
I mean, I totally agree with Sean on that. I mean, that's the biggest thing where I see the problem is, someone likes the color, and then they look at the data and they think the data doesn't agree with what they see. But it's not necessarily that the data doesn't agree. It's just we have to do a better job of educating people on what angle they're actually looking at. And I think that's really, really important.
Yes.
Because even I have said, oh my God, I don't like it. And I look at the data and I'm like, well, the data's not that bad, but that one angle stands out. I'm like, is that the angle I'm looking at? Like you really have to kind of use them together to get a really good idea of what's happening on the vehicle.
Yeah, an example there, I know that just kind of looking at that concept that Ray's mentioning there, there's an example recently with a color that we were working on a launch. And when you looked at all 5 angles, the 15, the 45, the 75, and the 110 were very close to master for both the body and the fascia. And if I wouldn't have had, but the 25-degree angle, we were super red and super yellow on the 25-degree only for the body. And everybody's scratching their heads going, oh no, oh no, oh no. But then when we received the data from our fascia supplier, and I don't know if he's on, but this was down in Mexico, so there's a chance. They sent us our data, and I sent him our data, and lo and behold, 25-degree angle, they were super red and yellow. So when we lined up everything for Harmony digitally, in order to get to, our pilot build, we didn't have to do a whole lot of work. And so what we're doing now is working in harmoniously with a common paint supplier for both those parts, a body and that fascia, is to work on the 25-degree angle so we can move that accordingly together as we want to move closer to standard. We won't accept the fact that, hey, visually everybody liked it and they say it's okay. We know, because we can look at data properly and look at all 5 angles, that we still have work to do on that 25 to truly be okay to standard for all 5 angles.
And that's what I talked about earlier, like the time of year. Like if he's looking at the same vehicle in June and then in September, it could be exactly the same color position. But if that one angle's off and now he's looking at that angle could totally affect what you see visually.
Exactly. And that's why there's more than just the viewing angle. There's all 5 angles that need to be correct to master.
Mm-hmm. And I think the other thing that, I don't know if it surprised me, but I was happy about was that, people are really open once you start sharing data. They feel like they're more in control of what's happening and they're not all in the dark,
Yeah.
So I think that's really good because everybody was super open to it, the fascia guys and the body guys, once we started doing this with Ford. So it was nice.
Yeah, exactly what Ray's saying there. The cross-functional team or I'm not just a supplier, I'm part of this process. That's very important to people when they feel that, the work they're doing has an impact. This data is just not, I don't think there's a worse feeling in the world when you're measuring something and you're not even sure where that data is going. But when you're taking this data and you're sharing it and you're getting involved and you have to read that data because you have data coming in and you're having to take, maybe multiple databases, looking at the body versus what we're doing, it helps people understand actually what's going on with their processes, and they feel like they're making an impact in this vehicle to be better. So I think that just the communication channels are one of the things that, as Ray said, made us really excited, because you start to have a vested interest into this as a part of, I'm doing my job, this person's over in this circle doing their job. Now these things are getting merged, and we're more of like, the concept that we like to use, one Ford. It's moving that forward in that direction to get to be a better product, whether it's supplier, it's OEM, it's the Ford OEM people themselves. I think it's highly, that makes me feel good.
Yeah, me too. I mean, that was my favorite part, pretty much. I mean, I'm glad that, your first PP builds are good, because that's what the goal was. But then the fact that people weren't upset about it, they were actually embracing it, was also very cool. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for sharing this project with us, Sean, and for your insight, Ray. Very valuable. We appreciate your time and expertise. What a great program and presentation for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You bet. And with that, we'll wrap it up. You folks on the phone, you'll see follow-up information tomorrow on this, and look forward to future invites to webinars and web seminars like this. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day. We appreciate you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.